So I just bought this truck. It's a 1978 Chevy Blazer, and as I'm going through it, I ran into a pretty common issue. That is, the tilt steering wheel is loose. Let me show you. When you grab the wheel's not really on right now because I just put it on for this, but when you grab the wheel, it moves pretty bad. Now, some people might think this is a U-joint or a bushing that's in the steering column somewhere. It's not. It's just 4 bolts that need to be tightened that are associated with the tilt steering mechanism in these cars. I thought it was a pretty straightforward fix, and it is, but as I realized that the process is different from 1973 to 1978 compared to 1978 to probably like 87 probably. So let's get started. You'll need 2 pretty cheap tools to do this job. One is a steering wheel pivot pin remover. I got this at Advanced Auto for 10 bucks. And then the other thing is a steering wheel remover set. Harbor Freight, like 30 bucks. Before you get into this job, make sure that you disconnect your battery. So I did some prep work in the beginning, and some of the steps up front are going to be a little quick, but they're pretty straightforward. First thing you want to do, take your steering wheel remover set and use it to remove the steering wheel. I already did that. Next, you're going to be faced with this plastic guard. Right at the base of this plastic guard, right in here, is a little C-clip. It's an absolute pain to get this off, but you do need to get it off. And that's where the second part of your steering wheel removing kit comes into play. You take it, screw it onto the threads of this shaft, and depress the steering wheel enough so that way you can get access to sliding off this C-clip. Once that's off, you can go ahead and remove this and remove this. And if you're having any horn issues, if your horn isn't working, now's a good time to go ahead and sand down or clean up this contact plate back here, because that should be what's operating your horn. Now is also a good time to note that as I'm doing this job, I'm keeping all of the parts that I'm pulling off this in order of which they go. So right down here is the steering wheel nut, some more stuff that holds on the steering wheel, and then the other components that we've removed. I'm just going to go down in a line so that way I'm not confused about, the order in which stuff goes. I know the floor is pretty messy, but whatever. Next is your turn signal assembly. So there's 4 screws that you need to remove here. There's one here, one here, one back here, and one down here. If your turn signal screws loose, go ahead and remove them. Your turn signal switch and maybe cruise control if you have it can just slide right out. It's connected by a wire. Over on the side right here, that is your hazard signal button. It's just a Phillips head screwdriver that holds that in, and you just unscrew it. Then before you remove your turn signal assembly, there's a spring that you just need to pull right off the center column, and your turn signal assembly should come out. Quick note, don't force this too much. It is connected by some wires down here, and if you do have an older model, there's not really a ton of slack in these wires, which brings us to the next step. You need to remove this, unplug it from this right here. Give you a better view. That, once you unplug it, and it's very brittle, so be careful, allows you to move this little wire piece up a little bit more, and that'll give you some more slack. You have that removed. Should be able to pull this out just a little bit more. Not much, but something. All right, now we're getting over to the ignition cylinder, and this is where it starts to get different for 78 and below GM cars and trucks. Those actually aren't Phillips heads in the new ones. I think they're Torx, but for the older models, they are Phillips head. And then we're going to remove the ignition cylinder once we unscrewed all 3 of these, and that's a little bit different as well. So go ahead and undo these 3. To remove the ignition cylinder on a 1973 to 1978, it's super simple. Don't do anything with this. Put your screwdriver right into this little slot right here. Press that. With that pressed, it comes right out. Basically what the screwdriver is doing is it's getting this little tab right here and it's depressing it. See that little tab? It presses down and in. That little tab is sitting right in that slot right there. With the ignition cylinder out, now it's time to remove the tilt steering handle. You just use an adjustable wrench, twist it. You'll notice there's two little flat spots that you can sit that adjustable wrench onto. Just keep turning it until it can work itself free. Unscrews. With the tilt steering handle removed, you're ready to pull off this housing. This housing should just wiggle right off. You might have to put a little force into it, possibly. And just watch out for wires and stuff. You don't want to tear any wires, especially going to the turn signal indicator. So just be very gentle when you pull that off. With that housing off, you're getting to the point of no return. Not actually, but this is where things start to look a little scary. Go ahead and pull this pin forward. That's going to sit on this. What we're trying to do is we're trying to remove this wire right here. So you're gonna have to pull this pin forward to give it a little slack. And then you're also going to have to loosen this nut. And that's gonna let this wire slide right out. All right, that's off. Then go ahead and unscrew this. Very, very careful. Let me just pop this out and I'll show you. You'll see on the sides, there are these two little tabs. One there and there's one on the other side. They sit in this groove and they lock. When you pull that off, there's another spring in here. Just go ahead and remove that spring. This is also probably a pretty good time to grease that up if yours looks anything like mine. So I'm gonna do that before I put it back in. And just so you understand, that spring sits right against that stud. So that spring is out. We're gonna go ahead and remove the pivot pins on both sides. There's one right here, and there's one on this side. I'm in the process of removing it using the pivot pin remover. Should be it. It's out. Time for the other side. That's what it looks like. You do have to remove this wire. So it's really just a matter of fishing this end off of this, and if you work it, it comes free. That's the orientation that it goes back in. That top loop sits right against, or right in that little groove right there. Once you have that wire out, go ahead, remove this piece right here. Should just come out right by hand. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. To get this section off, after you have removed the pivot pins from the side, you have to plug your tilt steering column handle back into the actual port that it goes. The threads on mine are stripped out, so I'm using just a screw for right now, but lift up on it. These teeth right here will release, and that will release this housing off of this fitting right here. If you have this housing off, it's time to actually adjust the loose tilt steering. It's these bolts. There's one in here, one here, which I have pulled out, and I'll show you in a second. There's one down here, there's one on the other side. Basically runs in a square pattern. There's 4 of these bolts. Here's one of them I pulled out. The head is size E8. It's a little bit of a weird size bolt. I threw a lot of Loctite on these. These were only hand tight in there, and that's actually why things are so sloppy. It's this housing right here. I'm pulling out each bolt at a time, putting Loctite on it, cleaning it, putting it back in, and then snugging it up. I'm gonna repeat that process for each bolt. Even tightening one of these bolts helped significantly. I was able to wiggle this before, but now with that bolt that I just threw back in there and tightened down, yeah, it's going good. It's holding pretty firm, so I'm just gonna repeat that process and start putting things back together. So the main housing is back on, those bolts are tightened. One quick tip, when you are putting this housing back on, you do have to have the tilt steering handle screwed in and pull it up and towards you. The reason for that is these teeth right here need to catch, so that way they can go in. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting to get this thing back on. You're going to be fighting these teeth. They're not going to want to actually go on. As you're putting things back together, I'd encourage you to just make sure that everything is lubricated properly. I'm just going through with some wheel bearing grease and you know, putting grease on anything that had old grease on it. Yeah, and then just go ahead and reverse the order and keep putting everything on. When you're putting this piece back in and compressing the spring, one tip: move your tilt steering up high, as angled upward as much as it'll go. That that expands this basically, or lengthens this, and you have to compress the spring the least amount. Then put something in here, compress the spring. I just used a screwdriver. I put it right through that hole. You can kind of see where I marred it up a little bit, and put it in, turn it clockwise, and it'll lock in place. As I'm going back through each layer of putting the steering wheel on, I'm just testing what I've put on. So for instance, I just threw the ignition coil back in, and I'm just testing to make sure that, you know, it works. Nothing's wrong there. I'm also looking at wires, making sure that nothing got jammed as another layer went back on. You know, watch out for the turn signal wire. Before, I just had to pop this off because it did get caught up in the ignition system, and it was rubbing. So, you know, just watch out for that kind of stuff as you're putting everything back on. Everything's back together. Check this out. Steering wheel's nice and firm. Truck starts up. My turn signal lights never worked in the first place, so that's its own fault. I think it's a blown fuse, but it operates. This is firm. That's it. Hopefully this is helpful. Yeah, till next time.